Hidden inside the story of Noah's flood, the Bible records an exact date, the 17th day of the 7th month, the day the ark finally came to rest on solid ground after the judgment. Most people read past it, but when you know what that date became on the Hebrew calendar, when you realize it is the exact same date as one of the most important events in the entire New Testament, everything about this story changes. And I mean everything. Stay with me for the next 40 minutes because we are going to go through this flood piece by piece. The geology, the archaeology, the ancient texts, the science, and by the time we get to the end, that date is going to hit you in a way you will not be able to forget. But here is what most people have never been told. The biblical account of Noah's flood is not just the oldest written version of this event. It is the most scientifically precise, geologically detailed, and historically verified record we have. And when you actually sit down and read what the Bible says happened, not the children's book version with the cartoon boat and the smiling animals, but the raw, unfiltered text, what you find is terrifying. Because the Bible does not describe a gentle rain that slowly covered the earth. The Bible describes something so violent, so total, so catastrophic, that modern geologists are still finding its fingerprints in rock layers across 6 continents. Stay with me for the next 40 minutes, because we are going to go through this event piece by piece. We are going to look at the ancient text, at the archaeology, at the geology, at the evidence from cultures around the world. And by the time we are done, you are going to understand why the flood is not just the most important story in Genesis. It is the most important event in the history of human civilization after creation itself. And we are going to start with a detail that almost nobody talks about. A detail hidden in plain sight in Genesis chapter 6 that changes everything about how we understand why this flood happened at all. The world before the flood was not like ours. We tend to imagine Noah's world as a slightly more primitive version of our own. People farming, building things, living their lives, just without smartphones. But the Bible paints a picture that is dramatically different from anything we experience today. And the more you look at it, the more unsettling it becomes. Genesis chapter 5 gives us a genealogy, the list of the patriarchs from Adam to Noah. Most people skim past it because it's just names and numbers. But stop there for a moment. Look at the numbers. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912 years. Enosh lived 905 years. Jared lived 962 years. Methuselah, the oldest man in the Bible, lived 969 years. These are not symbolic numbers. The original Hebrew text presents them as literal ages, and if we take them seriously, what they tell us is that the world before the flood was populated by people who had been alive for centuries. Noah himself was 600 years old when the flood came. Think about what that means for the accumulation of knowledge. If a single person lives 900 years, they watch 30 to 40 generations of descendants born and die around them. They accumulate expertise across every field imaginable over a lifespan 9 or 10 times longer than ours. The world before the flood was not primitive. It was ancient and deeply experienced in ways we cannot comprehend. And Genesis chapter 4 tells us something remarkable about this civilization. By the 7th generation from Adam, humanity had already developed metallurgy, working with bronze and iron. They had developed music with stringed instruments and wind instruments. They had developed animal husbandry and agriculture. This was not a world of cave-dwelling primitives. This was a sophisticated, technologically capable civilization. But something had gone catastrophically wrong with it. Genesis chapter 6 begins with one of the most mysterious passages in the entire Bible, and I want you to hear it exactly as it is written. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. The sons of God. That phrase in Hebrew is Bene ha-Elohim. And in every other place in the Old Testament where that precise phrase appears, in Job chapters 1, 2, and 38, it refers without question to angelic beings, members of the divine council, supernatural entities. What Genesis 6 is describing is an incursion, a violation of the boundary between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm. Supernatural beings, whether fallen angels or some other class of divine entities, taking human women as wives and producing offspring. The text calls those offspring the Nephilim. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root naphal, to fall, the fallen ones, or those caused to fall. Ancient Jewish interpretation found in texts like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Dead Sea Scrolls consistently understood these beings as giants, enormous, powerful, and deeply corrupted, and not just physically. Their corrupting influence spread throughout the entire human population. The very next verse in Genesis 6 tells us the result. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Every intention, only evil, continually. This is not a description of a society that is struggling with some moral failures. This is a description of a civilization that has been so thoroughly corrupted at its core that there is literally nothing good left in it. Whatever the Nephilim were, whatever this incursion produced, it had infected the entire human race. Not most of humanity, not the majority, all of it, except one man. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. That phrase, blameless in his generation, in Hebrew it is tamim. It means complete, whole, without blemish. Some scholars, including ancient ones, believe this is not just a moral description, but a physical one, that Noah's genetic line had remained uncorrupted by the Nephilim incursion. His bloodline was pure, and so God made a decision that would reshape the entire world. I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals, and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. That verse, Genesis 6 verse 7, is one of the most sobering sentences in all of Scripture. The Creator of the universe, looking at what his creation has become, is consumed by grief. The Hebrew word translated sorry or grieved is nacham. It means to breathe deeply, to sigh, to be moved with compassion to the point of action. This is not cold judicial punishment. This is a God in anguish, but God is not done. He goes to Noah. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. That word gopher, it has no direct translation in any modern language. We do not know with certainty what kind of wood it was. Some scholars suggest cypress. Others suggest a type of laminated wood, an ancient composite material that would have been extraordinarily strong. What we do know is that God gave Noah incredibly specific construction instructions, and those instructions describe something that could actually float. The dimensions God specifies are 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. A cubit in the ancient Near East was typically 18 inches. That gives us an ark approximately 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. This is not a small boat. This vessel would have a cargo capacity of approximately 1.4 million cubic feet. Naval engineers who have actually studied these dimensions, and this was researched extensively in the 20th century, have found that these proportions produce a remarkably stable vessel. The length-to-width ratio of 6:1 is virtually identical to the ratio used in modern large cargo ships. A vessel built to these specifications would be almost impossible to capsize even in extreme wave conditions, The ark had 3 decks. It had a single door on its side. It had a window. Some translations say a sohar, which might refer to a gap running around the entire upper portion for ventilation, and it was coated inside and out with pitch, bitumen, making it completely waterproof. Now stop and think about what this construction project actually involved. There are no power tools, there are no cranes, there are no sawmills. Noah and his sons, the Bible mentions Shem, Ham, and Japheth, are somehow building a vessel the size of a modern cruise ship liner, using hand tools and materials they have to source, cut, and process themselves. Ancient Jewish tradition says it took Noah 120 years to build the ark. 120 years of construction. 120 years of people watching this man build an enormous boat in what may have been an area with no nearby ocean. 120 years of people asking questions and being told that God was going to flood the entire world. 120 years during which not a single person outside of Noah's family believed him. New Testament scholar Peter calls Noah a preacher of righteousness. For over a century, Noah warned his generation, and his generation laughed. We will come back to that detail because it matters. Now God gives Noah the second part of his instructions, and this is where things get complicated and interesting. You shall take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. This is often where people get stuck. How do you fit every animal species on earth on a boat, even a large one? The answer is that you probably do not need to fit every species. You need to fit every kind. The Hebrew word is min, which corresponds much more closely to what biologists would call a genus or a family than what we call a species. Within a single created kind, there is enormous genetic potential for variation. The horses, donkeys, and zebras we see today likely descended from a single equine kind. The dozens of dog breeds that exist today, from Chihuahuas to Great Danes, descended from a single canine ancestor relatively recently in genetic terms. If Noah took representatives of each biblical kind rather than each modern species, the numbers become much more manageable. Studies by researchers at the Answers in Genesis organization estimated that fewer than 7,000 animals representing all the major kinds would need to be aboard the ark. Given the cargo capacity we just calculated, that is completely feasible. And there is another factor: size. God says he will bring the animals to Noah. He does not specify adults. Taking juvenile animals would dramatically reduce the space and food requirements. Many of the largest animals have juvenile forms small enough to be easily housed and managed. But let us not skip past something remarkable in the text. God says he will bring the animals to Noah. This is a supernatural coordination. We are not told Noah went hunting. The animals came to him, and they came in order. Clean animals by 7s, unclean animals in pairs, birds by 7s. This is organized, this is directed. Something or someone was orchestrating a migration of incredible precision. When Noah was 600 years old, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, and notice that precision, the Bible is giving us an exact date. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of heaven were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And on that same day Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives entered the ark with every beast, every creeping thing, every bird, everything that moves on the earth. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life, and the Lord shut the door behind them. That detail stops me every time. God himself closed the door, not Noah. The creator of the universe personally sealed the door of the ark. And everyone outside of that door, every human being, every breathing creature outside that vessel, was now separated from salvation by a door they had not walked through. Now let us talk about what actually happened, because Genesis chapter 7 uses very specific language to describe the mechanism of the flood, and modern geology has something fascinating to say about it. All the fountains of the great deep burst open, the fountains of the great deep, Tehom, the primordial deep. This phrase is referring to something beneath the earth, vast reservoirs of water stored in the subsurface under enormous pressure. For a long time, this sounded like poetic language, but in recent decades, geologists have discovered that the Earth does in fact contain enormous quantities of water stored in the mantle, in rock formations hundreds of miles below the surface. In 2014, researchers at Northwestern University discovered evidence of a reservoir of water stored in a mineral called ringwoodite in the Earth's transition zone, between 400 and 660 kilometers deep. The volume of water in this reservoir may be 3 times the volume of all the oceans on the Earth's surface, 3 times the oceans, stored in rock, deep underground. All the fountains of the great deep burst open. Whatever geological event triggered the flood, it was not merely rain from the sky. Something happened beneath the surface of the Earth. The Earth cracked open. The subsurface reservoirs, the fountains of the deep, erupted upward with catastrophic force. And then, additionally, the windows of heaven were opened. Rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. This would have been rain unlike anything experienced in human history, not just precipitation, but a sustained global deluge from the atmosphere. Perhaps the collapse of a water vapor canopy that some creation scientists believe surrounded the pre-flood Earth and contributed to the extraordinary lifespans of the antediluvian patriarchs. Within just a few days, the entire topography of the pre-flood world would have been unrecognizable. Rivers became inland seas, plains disappeared, mountains began to vanish under the rising water, and every human being who was not on the ark, hundreds of millions of people perhaps, was dying. The text in Genesis 7 says the water rose 15 cubits above the highest mountains. That is approximately 22 feet of water above the highest point of land visible at the time. Complete submersion, total global coverage. And then comes one of the most chilling verses in Genesis. And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. All of them. Gone. Here is where geology becomes one of the most powerful confirmations of the biblical account. If a global flood of the magnitude described in Genesis occurred, if the entire surface of the earth was covered in water for months, with massive hydrodynamic forces in motion, we would expect to find specific evidence in the rock record. We would expect to find thick layers of sedimentary rock covering vast areas of multiple continents, deposited rapidly rather than slowly. We would expect to find fossils of sea creatures at high elevations, including at the tops of mountain ranges. We would expect to find evidence of enormous catastrophic erosion events that carved vast geological features in very short periods of time. We would expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers all over the earth, and that is exactly what we find. The Grand Canyon in Arizona is perhaps the most dramatic example. This geological formation is 277 miles long, up to 18 miles wide, and over a mile deep. Conventional geology attributes its formation to slow erosion by the Colorado River over millions of years. But geologists who have studied the canyon in detail have noted several serious problems with that interpretation. The canyon walls show sharp, flat boundaries between rock layers that extend for enormous horizontal distances. If these layers had been deposited slowly over millions of years, we would expect to see evidence of erosion animal burrows, soil formation, and other activity between the layers. Instead, the boundaries are clean and flat, consistent with rapid sequential deposition. In 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted in Washington state. Within hours, volcanic mudflows deposited stratified rock layers up to 400 feet thick. Within days, a canyon 100 feet deep was carved through those layers by drainage from the eruption. A mini Grand Canyon formed in days, with geological features virtually identical to those of the Grand Canyon itself. Scale that up to a global flood event, and the geological formations we see across the Earth make extraordinary sense. The Himalayas, the highest mountain range on Earth, reaching over 29,000 feet, contain marine fossils at their peaks. Fossils of sea creatures at the top of the world. How did sea creatures get to the top of the world's tallest mountains? The answer geology gives is tectonic uplift. These mountains rose from an ancient seabed. But when did that tectonic upheaval occur? And was it connected to an event that dramatically reshaped the entire Earth? The Burgess Shale in British Columbia, Canada, one of the most famous fossil deposits in the world, contains billions of exquisitely preserved sea creatures from what paleontologists call the Cambrian explosion. These creatures appear suddenly in the fossil record, fully formed, representing virtually every major body plan that has ever existed on Earth. They do not gradually emerge from simpler ancestors. They simply appear, preserved in fine-grained sediment in perfect detail, as if they were buried rapidly under conditions that prevented decomposition. Rapid burial, perfect preservation, billions of animals, deposited in layers that extend across entire continents. The biblical description of all the fountains of the great deep bursting open, of a catastrophic, geologically violent event reshaping the entire surface of the Earth, is not inconsistent with what we see in the geological record. For many researchers, it is the most coherent explanation of what we see. On the Ark, the water ruled the world for 150 days. 150 days of silence, except for water. 150 days of the Ark, rising and falling on a sea that covered everything Noah had ever known, every city he had ever visited, every road he had ever walked, every face he had ever seen outside of his family. Gone. What was it like inside that vessel? 8 people, thousands of animals. The smell alone would have been extraordinary. The noise, the motion. No way to know if the Ark was holding together. No way to know if the water would ever recede. And yet, there is no record of panic, complaint, or doubt from Noah in the text. He simply obeys, and he waits. Genesis 8, verse 1, "But God remembered Noah." That phrase, God remembered Noah, after 150 days of silence. God had not forgotten. The word remembered in Hebrew, zakar, does not imply forgetfulness followed by recollection. It means God turned his active attention back toward Noah. It signals a turning point. The catastrophe is over. Now comes restoration. God sends a wind over the earth. The Hebrew word is ruach, the same word used in Genesis 1 verse 2 when the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters at creation. The same wind that moved at the beginning of creation now moves over the waters of recreation. This is intentional parallelism. The flood is not just a judgment, it is a recreation, a new beginning. The earth is being reset. The fountains of the deep were stopped. The rain from the heavens was restrained. The waters began to recede. After 150 days of rising and covering, the water began to fall. Then in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The mountains of Ararat. The Hebrew says Ararat. This is the ancient name for what we now call the region of Urartu, in modern eastern Turkey, near the border with Iran and Armenia. And in that region, rising to 16,854 feet above sea level, stands a volcanic mountain that has been called Mount Ararat for millennia. Reports of sightings of a large wooden structure on that mountain go back centuries. Byzantine scholars wrote about it. Marco Polo mentioned it. In the 20th century alone, there have been dozens of reported sightings by pilots, by military personnel, by climbers of what appears to be a large wooden structure partially buried in glacial ice near the summit. In 1949, a declassified CIA operation called Operation Ararat photographed an anomaly on the northeast ridge of Mount Ararat from aerial reconnaissance, an object roughly the size and shape consistent with a large wooden vessel, partially exposed from the glacier. The photographs remain in historical archives. A Turkish and Chinese expedition in 2010 claimed to have found wooden compartments inside a structure on Ararat at 14,000 feet, carbon dated to approximately 4,800 years ago, which would place it squarely in the time frame of a historical flood event. None of this is conclusive. The mountain is enormously difficult to access. The structure, if it exists, is buried in ice that shifts and moves. But the evidence is enough, barely enough, to keep serious researchers asking serious questions. 40 more days pass after the ark rests on Ararat, and then Noah opens the window and sends out a raven. The raven flies back and forth until the waters dry up. Then he sends a dove. The dove finds no place to set her foot. The water is still too deep over the land, and returns to the ark. Noah reaches out his hand and brings her back in. 7 days. He waits 7 days. Then he sends the dove again. This time, the dove comes back in the evening with an olive leaf in her mouth. An olive leaf. After months of total submersion, something is alive. Something has survived the flood. An olive tree, somewhere on the surface of the emerging land, has put out a fresh leaf. And Noah knows. The water is going down. Life is returning. He waits another 7 days and sends the dove a third time. This time, the dove does not return. She has found dry ground and stayed there. In the 601st year of Noah's life, in the first month, on the first day of the month, exactly 1 year and 10 days after the flood began, the face of the ground was dry. And then God speaks again. Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Be fruitful and multiply. These are exactly the words God spoke to Adam and Eve in the garden. Creation reset. The world begins again. Noah's first act outside the ark is one of the most profound in all of Scripture. He builds an altar. In the midst of a world that has just been completely destroyed and reformed, with the mud still settling and the landscape still unrecognizable, Noah's first action is worship. He takes some of every clean animal and bird and offers them as a burnt offering to God. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. This is a covenant that has been in effect every single day since Noah walked off that ark. Every morning when you wake up and the sun rises, that is the covenant of Noah. Every spring when seeds germinate and harvests come in, that is the covenant of Noah. The regularity and reliability of nature, the seasons, the cycles, the predictability of the physical world is grounded in this promise. Then comes the rainbow. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. Every time it rains, every time sunlight catches water in the atmosphere and that arc of color appears in the sky, God is remembering his covenant, not because he would forget without the reminder, but because he has attached his promise to something visible, something present in creation itself, so that both he and humanity can see the sign together. The rainbow is a war bow hung in the sky, a bow with no arrow, pointed nowhere, a weapon of war transformed into a symbol of peace between God and creation. But now we need to slow down and sit with something uncomfortable. Because while the Rainbow Covenant is a promise of mercy, the flood itself is a reality we cannot soften. This event happened. Real people died. Millions of them. Perhaps hundreds of millions. Every human being who had ever lived outside of Noah's 8. All of them were gone. How do we reconcile that with a God who is described in the New Testament as love itself? The first thing to understand is that the text is clear about what provoked the flood. This was not God wiping out people for minor offenses. The text says every intention of every human heart was only evil continually. It says the earth was filled with violence. The Hebrew word for violence here is Hamas, not just physical violence, but moral corruption, injustice, exploitation, the systematic destruction of everything good. Combined with the Nephilim incursion, the supernatural corruption of humanity's genetic and spiritual nature, what we have is a situation with no human solution. The second thing to understand is that God waited. He waited 120 years after commissioning the ark before sending the flood. 120 years of Noah preaching. 120 years of anyone who chose to could have walked up to that construction site and said, "Noah, how do I get in the ark?" And the door was not shut by Noah. God shut the door, which means until that door closed, it was open. The flood was preceded by the longest recorded period of grace and warning in human history. And the third thing to understand is this: what God destroyed in the flood was a world so thoroughly corrupted by supernatural evil that it had lost the capacity to produce what God intended creation to produce. The incursion of the Nephilim, the infection of every human heart, the violence that had saturated every relationship and institution. This world was not redeemable. It was, in the most literal sense, a world where the image of God in humanity had been almost entirely effaced. And God, the creator of that image, was not going to allow that corruption to be the final word. This is not a comfortable analysis. I'm not presenting it to make you feel better about the flood. I'm presenting it because it is what the text actually says, and we owe it to the text to take it seriously. Now I want to take you somewhere unexpected, because the story of Noah's flood does not end with the rainbow. It echoes forward through the entire Bible in ways that most readers miss. Jesus himself referenced the flood, and when he did, he was not using it as a historical illustration. He was using it as a prophetic template. In Matthew chapter 24, the disciples asked Jesus about the signs of his coming and the end of the age. And Jesus says, "For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." As the days of Noah, Jesus is not saying the end times will be slightly similar to Noah's days. He is saying it will be a direct parallel. And when we look at what characterized Noah's days, supernatural incursion, comprehensive moral corruption, violence filling the earth, the majority of humanity oblivious to incoming judgment while a small group is warned and preserved, that parallel carries enormous prophetic weight. Peter, writing in his second letter, makes this even more explicit. He says, "God did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly." Then Peter says, "But by the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly." stored up for fire. Just as the pre-flood world was stored up for water, the mechanism changes, the judgment does not, and Peter is clear that this coming judgment has a specific trigger and a specific timing, just as the flood did. This is not theological speculation. This is the consistent testimony of the New Testament, spoken by Jesus himself. The flood is not merely past history, it is prophetic pattern. Let us look now at something that has fascinated ancient scholars for millennia, the numerical structure of the flood narrative. The flood begins on the 17th day of the second month. The ark rests on the 17th day of the seventh month, exactly 150 days apart. The numbers 7 and 17 appear with remarkable frequency throughout the narrative. Noah waits 7 days between releasing doves, the clean animals bored by sevens. The flood lasts 40 days and nights, 40, a number that appears throughout Scripture in contexts of trial and testing. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness. Israel wandered 40 years. Jesus fasted 40 days. The number 40 is not coincidental in biblical narrative. These precise numbers suggest something about the nature of this text. This is not oral legend that has been embellished over generations. This has the internal structure of a historical document. Dates, durations, measurements, quantities. The kind of detail that only matters if someone was actually there and actually recording what happened. And here is where the comparative mythology becomes crucial. The Babylonian flood account, known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, contains a flood story with many similarities to Genesis. A flood covering the earth. A boat built to divine specifications. Animals brought aboard. A bird sent out to test if the waters had receded. A mountain where the boat rests. For a long time, scholars used this similarity to argue that the biblical account was borrowed from Babylonian mythology. But the direction of influence is actually a much more interesting question than that. Because when you compare the two accounts in detail, the Gilgamesh account has all the features of a story that has been embellished and mythologized over time. Multiple gods arguing, a boat that is a perfect cube, which would be completely unseaworthy, a flood lasting only 7 days. The Genesis account, by contrast, has internally consistent dimensions that work hydrodynamically, a precise timeline with specific dates, and a coherent theological framework. The Gilgamesh account looks like a distorted memory. The Genesis account looks like the source. Two cultures, both remembering the same catastrophic event. One with a confused, mythologized version, one with a precise, coherent, historically detailed account. The better question is not which one borrowed from the other. The better question is, what actual event are both of these stories remembering? The Dead Sea Scrolls contain a fragmentary text known as the Genesis Apocryphon. This document, dating to roughly the 1st century before Christ, retells the flood story with additional details drawn from ancient tradition. It describes Noah as different in appearance from other men, with eyes that shone like the sun and a face that seemed to radiate light. This document also expands on the building of the ark and the sending of the birds, adding details that do not appear in Genesis but are consistent with ancient Aramaic traditions about Noah. The Book of Jubilees, a text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and considered authoritative by the Ethiopian Jewish community, gives additional detail about the Nephilim and their offspring, describing them as increasingly violent beings who turn to cannibalism and bloodshed, and connecting their presence directly to the moral conditions that precipitated the flood. The first book of Enoch, which we have covered extensively in a previous video, presents the most detailed ancient tradition about the Nephilim and their connection to the flood. Enoch is presented as a prophet who warned Noah about the coming judgment, and who himself was taken by God before the flood came. The New Testament letter of Jude quotes directly from the Book of Enoch, confirming that at least some of its content was considered authoritative by first-century Jewish Christians. What all of these ancient sources confirm is that the flood event was understood by people across the ancient world as the defining catastrophe of human history, an event so total, so complete, so final, that it divided all of human existence into two eras: before the flood, after the flood. Our civilization, every civilization that exists today, is post-flood. We are all, according to Genesis, descendants of Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10 traces the distribution of peoples across the ancient world back to these three men and their descendants. And remarkably, when scholars compare this table with ancient linguistic and cultural evidence, the correspondences are extraordinary. The Semitic peoples, the people of Israel, Assyria, Babylon, Aram, traced to Shem. The peoples of Egypt, Canaan, and sub-Saharan Africa traced to Ham. The peoples of the Indo-European world, including the ancestors of the Greeks, the Persians, the Celts, and eventually the entire Western world, traced to Japheth. Every human being alive today traces their ancestry back to 8 people who stood on the deck of a wooden vessel and watched the waters recede from a drowned world. There is one more thing I want to bring to your attention before we close. Something so specific, so precise, and so overlooked that when I first noticed it, I had to go back and verify it 3 times. The flood begins on the 17th day of the 2nd month of Noah's 600th year. The ark rests on the 17th day of the 7th month. In the Jewish calendar that was later established by Moses, the 7th month became the 1st month, Nisan, because it was the month of the Exodus, the month God declared to be the beginning of months for Israel. And the 14th of that month became Passover. The 15th and 16th were the days of Passover week, and the 17th of that first month, the 17th of Nisan, became the date of one specific event in the New Testament: the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The ark coming to rest, finding solid ground after the judgment, happened on the same date as the resurrection. The vessel that carried the preserved remnant of humanity to safety rested on the 17th of the 7th month. And the one who is described in the New Testament as carrying the judgment for all of humanity rested on the 17th of the 1st month. I'm not making a trivial point here. The New Testament explicitly calls Jesus the last Adam, the one who reverses and redeems what the first Adam set in motion. And just as the flood reset creation and established a new covenant and a new beginning, the resurrection of Jesus establishes a new covenant and a new creation, one that will ultimately culminate in the complete renewal of heaven and earth. The ark is a type, a shadow, a preview. It is a vessel of salvation entered through a single door, sealed by God Himself, carrying its occupants through judgment to a new world. The New Testament uses the ark directly as a type of baptism and of salvation in Christ. Peter writes, God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you. The flood did not just reshape the physical world. It planted a pattern in the structure of sacred history, a pattern of judgment and grace, of total loss and total renewal, of one way of escape that many ignore and few enter, that finds its ultimate fulfillment in the death and resurrection of the Son of God. We started with 270 flood stories scattered across every culture on Earth. We have traveled through the pre-flood world and its terrifying corruption. We have looked at the ark's construction and its remarkable seaworthiness. We have walked through the geological evidence that continues to accumulate in the rock layers and sediment beds of 6 continents. We have heard the testimony of ancient texts, from Babylon to the Dead Sea Scrolls, all pointing back to the same catastrophic event. And we have followed the narrative thread from Noah to Jesus, from the ark to the resurrection, from the Rainbow Covenant to the new creation. The flood is not a children's story. It is the most geologically attested, most cross-culturally remembered, most prophetically loaded event in human history outside of creation itself. It is a story about what happens when corruption reaches the point of no return, and about a God who will not allow that corruption to be the final word. The door of the ark was open for 120 years, and then God closed it. The question the story of Noah always comes back to is not whether the flood happened. The question is, which side of the door are you on? Every ancient culture that remembers the flood remembers it as the end of one world and the beginning of another. The Bible agrees, and the Bible adds something no other flood tradition includes: the promise that it will happen again, not with water, but with fire. Not without warning, not without an ark. And the one who shut the door of the ark is the same one who says, in the final book of the Bible, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him." The door moves differently this time. This time, you choose.